Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and with me this morning is a returning friend of the show, Andy Ellis, who is running for, I hate it when I can't talk, running for governor of Maryland in 2026, and we're almost there now.
Yeah, we're getting close, way closer than we were anytime we talked before. And yeah, I'm excited to be back on the show and have a general conversation, let you know where we are.
So what's Westmore's scorecard so far?
It depends on what thing, but I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who see Westmore as a very good politician, not as a very good governor.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of across the board, that's the feeling. I think that's the feeling within his party, without his party. And I think that the people who see him as a good governor are mostly excited that he could be a good future politician and are not actually watching how he's governing.
He seems to be, he's on the list of a lot of people's he should run for president polls without really much reason that I can see for it, other than the fact that he won the governorship a little while ago.
Right. I think he has a charming politician's story. And I think he's good as a politician. I think when he's out on the trail, he gives good speeches. When he's on TV, he talks about values and solutions. When he's governing, I am not that excited about it. And I think a lot of people aren't. This year we faced a $3 billion deficit. And after years of punting on progressive taxation, he kind of finally rolled it out. But he rolled it out with a whole bunch of regressive fees and while pushing a bunch of other money off to the counties and things like that. And it is all just stage play in a lot of ways. And, there's some other things that happen that just, feel entirely unexciting. At the end of the year, he was mad at the General Assembly because they didn't help him lower corporate tax rates or build more nuclear power plants. And it is like, all right, I could see somebody being upset about that, but certainly not somebody who people bill as a progressive Democrat.
I've noticed that even a lot of people that I would consider reasonably progressive or even fairly socialist see nuclear power as green energy, which maybe it's because of my age and remembering the 80s and being scared of that last little era where we were actually seriously scared of US Soviet Armageddon. It just seems like we don't need more nuclear power, but maybe that's just me and my part of my era and age.
I am of your era and of your age in a party that is pretty strongly against nuclear power.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when we be clear, if somebody can come to me with a plan for safe, cheap nuclear power that we can put under the control of public utilities that are democratically controlled, and that can allow us to get out of the regional grid run by the power companies and the fossil fuel companies, so that we can lower rates for Maryland and build an economy that works for everyone, I will be the first to welcome that meeting and to welcome that proposal. I'm not against nuclear power because of an ideological opposition to it. I'm against it because as of right now, I haven't seen a plan for it that is safe, affordable, and can work outside of corporate control.
Well, and but here's the thing: even the safest facility produces dangerous trash that you have to do something with.
Yeah, and I mean, it does, and so does the production. No energy is clean.
This is true.
And so I guess the way that I look at it, like, energy is a real issue in Maryland right now.
I bet.
Energy is a real issue in Maryland right now because we don't have much land to do solar and wind with. So, the advantage that a lot of bigger states have is they have a lot of land to put solar and wind on, but we don't. We're a small state. We don't have a lot of land for that. And rightfully, we're shutting down old gas and coal plants. And we had to remove trash incineration from our renewable portfolio this year. And trash incineration was ever in our renewable portfolio to make the like sort of BS portfolio idea work in the first place. And Virginia is building all these data centers. And because Virginia is like the world's leader in building data centers, and because we're in a regional cooperative, we have all these high voltage utility lines running through the state. That's basically like an extension cord from Pennsylvania to Virginia in order to run their data centers. So rates are going up. New lines are coming in. New projects are not coming online. So the biggest thing for us is to get out of that regional consortium that we're in right now that is run by energy companies and fossil fuel companies, and allow the state to reassert control over energy production in the state of Maryland so that we can produce, and we can produce what we need, we can reduce rates, and we can get new renewable projects online.
No, and that sounds really important. I mean, there's so much that Maryland would have to divest from in order to reinvest in useful stuff. But I think the divestments are worth doing in the first place. I remember you were talking the last time you were on the show about finding ways to divest from the military-industrial complex.
Yeah. And I mean, so in Western Maryland and Cumberland, there was just recently an announcement that a new company is opening up a new facility there, and they're going to help, do missile production or aeronautics.
Oh, of course.
Right. And it's like in a place where the industry has all left and there are no good manufacturing jobs, there are only service jobs and remote jobs and medical jobs. I can understand why they'd be excited to have any manufacturing facility come in. And it's like, I don't think we need to say no. I don't think we need to keep those folks without manufacturing in that county, but we need to provide a kind of manufacturing that is not built on the war economy, not built on the extraction economy, and allows them to thrive without having to build missiles.
Missiles are one of the few things made in the U.S. anymore that aren't made in prisons.
Right. And I mean, I don't know. I think divesting from figuring out not just what the divestment part looks like, but figuring out what the new Maryland economy looks like a decade from now, after deindustrialization, after defederalization, figure out what a new economy looks like that works for everyone. I don't think it's based on missiles, and I don't think it's based on having to get our energy from a consortium run by fossil fuel companies and energy corporations.
And I'll be honest, I'm a little skeptical of the whole idea that we can just reindustrialize the U.S. economy.
Sure. It's not going to be the same kind of, I mean, I don't think we can reindustrialize. I don't think we can try to replace the industry that has left by redoing it. Steel is not going to get built here. Chips are not going to get built here. TVs are not going to get built here for the most part. But I do think that that place we're talking about, Western Maryland, it's in Appalachia. And one of the ideas that we've been looking into is increased hemp growing in Allegheny County, right? Allegheny County has good land that could be used for hemp. It has infrastructure built for manufacturing. And if you have a place that grows and manufactures a variety of different kinds of hemp, you might be able to kickstart some other manufacturing businesses and things like that. And look, like it's, I kind of joke, like, as a Green Party candidate, there's always people coming to you with proposals about how to use hemp.
Of course.
In order to rebuild the world. And in some places it works. In some places it's a crop we should absolutely explore in a manufacturing base that we could build right here that doesn't require us to import rare earth metals from China.
Hemp oil refineries.
Yeah, sure. All sorts of things. Rope, clothes, paper, and then there's all this stuff about like the technology.
I'm gonna show my age again. I remember Woody Harrelson driving the bus that ran on hemp gas across the country.
Right, right. I mean, think about it this way. Like, imagine that large parts of Appalachia were to start growing industrial hemp, and formerly industrial small town like Cumberland that sits at the top of the Potomac River and at the top of a bunch of rail lines rebuilds its industrial base by being the place where that gets processed and then sent down to the rest of the world. It's like it could be a pretty significant change in the way a town like that works, and it's not the only solution, but it is part of imagining what a different kind of economy looks like. And Maryland just passed this thing that allows more sophisticated cooperatives to form, worker cooperatives to form and to come either out of existing businesses or as new businesses. And it's like in the real big vision of it, it's like we're going to set up hemp growing and manufacturing cooperatives in Cumberland that help put people back to work in a city which once had a huge industrial base and now has hospitals and federal workers working from home.
And that's a huge, just the economic change of the mid-Atlantic states and formerly industrial Northeast.
Yep.
Over the last, I mean, the global supply chain isn't something that I think somebody can just flip a switch and turn off.
Nope.
I think that people are dependent on that now. I mean, We're seeing that in the tariffs, the way the tariffs are affecting everything. And I think that foreign policy becomes about how can we guarantee both a fair shake for our workers at home and also maximizing the benefits to the workers overseas supporting our lifestyle.
Yep.
As opposed to just enriching the same billionaires over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, like, even if Trump brings these factory jobs back to the U.S., they're not coming to Maryland or Washington or Oregon. They're not coming to places with labor standards and environmental standards because there's no way he can do that while continuing to keep prices.
They're going to go to right-to-work states with union-busting Republican governors in the South and Midwest.
Right. They're going to go to right-to-work states, and they're going to go to prison labor states.
Yes.
Right. And and they're going to go to border areas. When the new immigration plan is you can work in our factory, but then you got to go back across the border. I mean,
something like 80 to 90% of everything with a made in the USA label is already made in prisons now, I think.
Yeah. And so it's like, if we want to think about, deindustrialization is one part of it. Maryland is the state that is going to be hit the most by the Doge cuts, by the Trump funding cuts and things like that. There was a Moody's report that came out the other day that said that we have the biggest risk of going into a depression or a recession as a result of Trump economic policies. And if you think about the things that drive the state of Maryland's government or the state of Maryland's economy, every single one of them is in the crosshairs of Trump. We have the third highest number of federal employees, the second highest number of federal contractors. We have research facilities, we have universities, we have hospitals that are paid for with a lot of state and federal money. We have a big education sector. We have nonprofits and NGOs. Go on down the line, and each one of those things is targeted by the Trump administration. And then that's even before we get to the tariffs. Our leading Canada's our leading export partner in the state of Maryland, and the Port of Baltimore is one of the biggest manufacturing and import and export sectors, and it's hit by the tariffs. So, Maryland is in real trouble. Sparrows Point Steel Mill in Baltimore County, which is sort of an iconic symbol of when we did steel here. It had 30,000 people that lost jobs from the height of its time in the 70s or 80s until through the 90s and early 2000s. 27,000 federal workers and 5,000 federal contractors have already been laid off.
Yeah.
Another like 5 to 6,000 researchers have been laid off. So we're talking about kinds of job cuts in Maryland right now in the first 4 months of this year that are parallel to one of the biggest steel plants on the East Coast closing over a course of decades, you know. And you know, Montgomery County, which is right outside of DC, has 30 million square feet of commercial office space leased to the federal government right now. And if they leave, like the entire economy of the county is vastly transformed, you know. And so Maryland is in a really bad spot, and there's no sort of going back. Just like after deindustrialization started, there was no rebuilding that industrial core with those kind of union jobs again. Similarly, well, even if Democrats sweep the House and the Senate in 2026 and take back the presidency in 2028, I don't think they're like rebuilding the Goddard Space Center if it gets shut down. And they're not, you know, they're not hiring a lot of these jobs, especially when you hear them talk about how much they agree that waste and inefficiency is a problem in government, right? Like some of it may come back, but we can never rely on that 10% of our economy that came from the government as of 2019.
No, and I think that, I mean, and that was kind of the whole point, is that the whole attack on federal jobs was this idea that all these people with these federal jobs weren't doing real jobs that mattered, and they deserved to be they deserved to lose their jobs because their jobs were unimportant and didn't matter and didn't produce anything for anyone. Yeah. By which people like Elon Musk meant didn't make a profit for them.
Right.
And while I get that federal contractors are laying off in the short term, in the long term, regardless of who ends up being president and running Congress, the whole point of destroying these government agencies is so that whatever government capacity does replace them is privatized and contractor driven rather than direct government employment.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
I agree. And I think the thing is that they're not coming back to Maryland, they're not coming back to DC, and they're not coming back to Northern Virginia. So I think we're going to see a world in which there are booms of federal contractors in Tennessee and in Idaho and in Texas and in Utah and places like that, where the right has sort of identified their pockets of technology growth outside of, you know,
well, like that contract in Puerto Rico for the energy grid to be maintained by an outfit in Montana,
right,
called Whitefish Energy, Wyoming, called Whitefish Energy, that just happened to be run by Congressman Ryan Zinke.
Right, exactly, right. And I think you're going to see a lot of those things where the contractors are going to come from the red states, not the blue states of the Mid-Atlantic.
So, and there's been a pattern to that too. You notice that Trump, even in his first term, was punishing blue states by cutting their funding while giving red states lots of money.
Yep. And you know, and he keeps threatening the funding over this, that, and the other. And what's interesting is Democrats in Maryland are conveniently using those threats to funding to not do things that their base likes, but that the polls don't support. So let me tell you a quick anecdote about this. Maryland has 6 counties that have 287G agreements with ICE. That means local sheriffs can participate in deportation efforts and can run the deportation pipeline out of their sheriff's office. So there was a bill introduced this year that would have made Maryland compliant with the Lake and Riley Act and turned over anybody who was convicted of any of the crimes outlined in the Lake and Riley Act, and B, would have ended the 287G agreements. Right now, before the session began, before the legislative session began in January, there was a poll by a relatively moderate to conservative pollster who found that like 70% of Marylanders wanted the state and local government to cooperate with ICE, including like 65% of Democrats. So the word got out really early that Governor Moore and Senate President Bill Ferguson were doing everything they could to kill this 287G bill. And they did it because it would, as much as their base and the people who show up for protests were excited to be able to kill that, most people in January, before the Trump administration started, wanted government to cooperate with us. So they killed it literally in a back room on the last night of the legislative session. Like literally, the leaders of the Senate went into a back room and pulled 287G protections out of the bill and passed it with some other watered down stuff. Now, the reason they gave was because the Trump administration would cut all of their funding for X, Y, and Z if they, passed a bill like this.
Yeah.
And they've done that conveniently where it makes sense for them to say that. And in other places, they're like, we're giving the attorney general hundreds of millions of dollars so he can sue the Trump administration. And it's like, okay, which is it?
It's all a matter of where it benefits them to be seen as fighting for their donors and where it doesn't, is my guess.
Yeah. Now, what will be interesting is a lot happened between January and April and public sentiment as it related.
Well, for example, I just have to share this because it's one of the few good things that made me smile that I've ever seen on like liberal pro-Democratic Party podcasting. So they show this town hall for Chuck Grassley in Iowa. And this little old man, like, Chuck Grassley's age practically, looks at Chuck Grassley and says in this serious tone, like it's the most important issue on his mind right now, are you going to El Salvador and getting that boy back?
Yeah. Right.
Now, this is a Chuck Grassley constituent close to Chuck Grassley's age.
Right.
White old man saying this.
Right. And so think about this as it happens in Maryland. In January, a poll tells the relatively conservative Maryland Democrats who have presidential and future aspirations that this is a bad idea. So they kill a bill that by April would have stopped ICE from participating with local sheriffs. And Wes Moore, instead of standing up and saying, I will stand up for Kilmar Abregu Garcia, could have actually stood up for him and said, like, we may not be able to get him back. We'll let Van Hollen handle that or whatever.
I mean, mind you, he's always had moments.
Yeah.
But I didn't expect Chris Van Hollen to have that much of a spine.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was great that Chris Van Hollen went down there and had that conversation. I think it was great that Chris Van Hollen did that work. And then I was real excited about Chris Van Hollen until last weekend when he was on State of the Union on CNN.
Yeah.
And they were asking him, like, well, if we bring him back and a judge says that he has to be deported, are you okay with that? And his answer was like, I'm okay with whatever the rule of law says. And I think this is sort of the limits of the Democrats' position on this.
It is.
Because it's like the answer has to be like, at the end of the day, a judge's ruling is a judge's ruling, but I do not think this man should be deported. I think that he's doing X, Y, and Z. And he's like trying to have it both ways there. And I think that's the limit of the rule of law argument that Democrats are making.
Liberals appear totally unwilling to ask any questions about why the border is suddenly so political again.
Right.
They seem to be just totally content to go along with the fact that it is political, and they seem really eager to find some compromise with the furthest of the far right on this politicized border issue. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think So let me go back and say, I think it is amazing that Chris Van Hollen went to El Salvador to make sure that that man is still alive and put pressure on the Salvadoran government to let them know if Democrats are back in power. I mean, I can't imagine that the conversation was like, "Hey, let me see him. Come on, I want to see him. It would be really nice." I imagine the conversation was like, "When we get back in power, we will make sure that your country never has any trade or interaction."
Yeah, the only reason that somebody makes that happen is because Chris Van Hollen says, I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee.
Right.
You don't want to make an enemy out of me right now.
Right.
I get that. And that means he's willing to put a certain amount of his credit on the line in order for that meeting to happen.
Yeah.
So that I can't complain about that.
No, and I won't. And I will, beyond not complaining about it, I will say good job. Like, we need more Democrats who are willing to use power that way in order to resist the administration. If more were doing that, I think there would be better outcomes happening right now. So good job on Chris. Like,
nobody has that energy that Julian Castro had in 2020 when he said, "I'm going to decriminalize border crossings."
Right. And I mean, look, if Maryland had banned 287G agreements and the mega sheriffs had to shut down their deportation pipelines, right? Like, certainly we would end up in court. Certainly some money would be withheld and things like that. But here's what I keep trying to tell Democrats: that money is going away anyway, right? Like, if it's not like Trump only disagrees with the progressive Democrat agenda a little bit. He disagrees with it entirely and wants to attack all of it.
Columbia University surrendered completely to Trump and still got their endowment hit with an attempt to cut all their federal funding.
Right. And so it's like we can't keep using, and the risk of using that as an excuse, like Democrats are doing for political purposes right now, is they're willing to cave when it works for them. But sooner or later, Trump is a pretty good deal maker. Trump is going to understand that and put them across something where they either cave and lay their bullshit hand on the table, or where they don't cave and he takes the money away. Right. But,
and he's going to take the money away, whatever they do. Right. This is a pattern. We've seen it before. He's not suddenly a different person.
No.
The biggest criticism I have of the Democrats is still, you have to vote for us because Trump is a fascist. And then when they lose, we're going to make sure we peacefully hand over power and no one can complain. But sir, you said he's a fascist. Isn't that dangerous?
Right. And it's like, this dance is occurring on a variety of different things. And so there's sort of an old Annapolis thing that I think happens in every state government, but especially happens here, where they kick the can down the road. They say, this is not the year to deal with renters rights, even though Maryland has the highest eviction rate of any state in the country and it is soaring upwards. This is not the year to deal with that problem. Good cause eviction has been in front of the state legislature for the last, I think, 10 or 11 years. And good cause eviction is not like the gold standard of renter protections, but it is better than not having it.
Yeah.
Right? And like, they keep kicking the can down the road on that. The new trick that they've added is we couldn't do this thing because Trump will take our money away. Mm-hmm. So you get the combination of those two things, and you get a pretty disappointing veto-proof majority in the, Democratic trifecta in Maryland that is as disappointing as can be.
We understand that you don't want to change the eviction laws to disadvantage landlords in any way because you all have money in real estate trusts. We get that.
Right.
Just like you don't want to ban insider trading in government because you all trade stocks.
Right. Right. And the Bill Ferguson, the Democratic president of the Senate, said, well, maybe we'll do this, but we're going to put something in that says you can either have rent stabilization or you can have good cause eviction, but you can't have both.
That just seems cruel.
Right. Right. Like,
shouldn't people, I mean, isn't rent stabilization and good cause eviction like the very, very bare minimum?
right. Like, we're not demanding that you like eminent domain those apartment complexes and allow people to live in them. We're asking that people have a reason for evicting somebody and that rents.
No. Now, mind you, that is exactly my political platform in a perfect world is yes, eminent domain that, or even better, eminent domain that office building with that 90% vacancy rate. Right. And convert that into affordable housing. It's not too hard. It just takes a few electrical and plumbing changes.
Or grow hemp in it.
They're ready to go.
Or grow hemp in it.
Yeah, vertical farming, grow hemp. I mean,
right. Like, I mean, and I think that's the thing here is it's like the things that we are calling for are not radical things, right? Like, it is not radical to say that Maryland sheriffs should not run an eviction pipeline that picks people up at their kids' schools and ships them off to El Salvador. That's not a radical thing to say. You know, it's not radical to say don't let people evict their tenants without a good reason. And it's not radical to say that rent in the state with the highest level of evictions should not be stabilized at some degree. Like, these are perfectly normal things to say.
Maybe it's just me, but with the Abrego Garcia case in the media, a vanguard party would be saying this is exactly why our sheriff should not be cooperating with a lawless federal government deportation establishment.
That's what we're saying, and that's what we're saying alongside the liberal democratic organizations that advocate for immigrants. They agree with us on that, right? And we understood that was the problem in January when the Democrats were afraid of the poll that came out that said people don't want this. We understood what Trump was going to do, and they were cowering in fear of a poll instead of a president who wants to extend federal power to destroy states like ours.
I am boggled by the way the Democrats repeatedly play it both ways. On the one hand, the Republicans are fascists. And on the other hand, well, we can only do so much because fascism is polling well right now.
Right. And I mean, Democrats in Maryland were the ones who introduced the bills to crack down on campus protest. Yes. They were the ones who introduced the bills to pass mask bans. They were the ones who refused to pass a bill that would stop auto-charging young people as adults for 26 crimes, even though we have the highest number of, highest percentage of our prison population that is an adult prison that was charged as adults as young people in the nation. Right? Like, these are real problems with tangible solutions. And like the auto charging bill that I mentioned there, it didn't say that a judge wouldn't be able to kick a juvenile up to adult court if they needed to. It just says it doesn't start there automatically based on the charge. It's a simple fix that would have implemented suggestions of this commission that the governor convened, the Equal Justice Commission, had 18 recommendations. This is one of the recommendations. So this isn't even like radical outsiders making this suggestion. This is his own commission making this suggestion.
I mean, heck, until recently, the Democratic Party's official platform was indistinguishable from Bernie Sanders' platform. You wouldn't hear it from listening to Democratic politicians talk, but that's what their platform said. Now they changed that more recently. Kamala Harris totally remade reality to match, the official record to match reality.
Right.
But until...
And in some ways, good for her. Right?
Yeah, I suppose.
In some ways, like, appreciate the honesty. Thank you very much for like saying what your party actually believes as your platform instead of some aspirational thing that you use in order to like punch to the left.
But now you're going to see that come back as everybody coalesces around this idea that, maybe if we run AOC, we can get the White House back.
Yeah, I mean, good luck to her. Right? Good luck to them. Like, have at it. I mean, I don't know. It's like, yeah, go do that thing. We'll see how it works. We have a pretty good idea of how it's going to work because we've seen how it works.
My guess is that even if it succeeds, we end up with a neoconservative Clinton-esque president who was once a progressive. I mean, that's what happened with, arguably, if Barack Obama was ever genuinely a progressive, it didn't last once he was president.
Yeah. And look, if President AOC and Vice President Sanders come in and decide that, we need to have healthcare and they can get it done, and they have, if they can do what they say they want to do, more power to them. I've yet to see the Democratic Party.
Here's where I see the cleverness. I hate to say it. Here's where I see the cleverness in what the Democrats have done, because they've poisoned the well using Trump. Because Trump has done so much that they've been able to say is bad for national security. Just imagine what would happen if a president, and I don't even think they would actually do this anymore to the degree that people who suggested this once thought they might. But if President AOC really appointed Dr. Cornel West as director of national intelligence with the purpose of wrecking the machine, the liberal Democrats would be up in arms along with the conservative Republicans.
Yeah.
In ways that we already see from the liberal reaction to Trump.
Right.
Who isn't even really destroying the national security system in the way the Democrats pretend.
Right. Yeah. Look, I mean, if President AOC and Vice President Sanders or whatever can make a new deal or something, whatever they, if that happens, great. I don't have any belief that it's going to happen. And I don't have any belief that the Democratic Party is going to allow that to happen. And if they do, I think they will fight tooth and nail to water it down, because we got these signs for the May Day rally that say billionaires run both parties. The Green Party is the future. And until we tackle the billionaires running both parties problem, I don't think that President AOC can solve the problems.
Howard Buffett, J.B. Pritzker, Bill Gates, Reid Hoffman. There are lots of unsavory people giving lots of money to the Democratic Party to protect their interests.
Right.
I mean, Howard Buffett is the worst of both worlds. He's a billionaire and a cop.
Right. And it's like, and the tech billionaires would be falling all over Democrats if they thought Democrats were the one who would protect their profit base,
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's not like they are actually ideologically, they have now aligned themselves ideologically with the sort of techno-libertarianism that they're willing to see out of the MAGA movement. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't align themselves with techno-liberalism if they thought that would bring them the profits.
Well, I mean, and the whole thing about this Silicon Valley techno-libertarianism is they want to not need Wall Street anymore. They want to be able to do everything with their own venture capital and their own banks and not really need Wall Street.
Right. And I mean, I agree with that sentiment. Like, I hope Maryland can figure out a way to move away from Wall Street toward public banking, toward a, de-Wall Streetified credit.
Yeah, but what we don't want is the Silicon Valley tech billionaires to replace Wall Street.
Totally. And that's why it's like, identifying the problem is not the only step we need to take. We need to understand the values we have and the solutions that come from those values, so that we don't be like, down with Wall Street and up with Technobank or whatever it is,
Well, look at all this destruction of the stock market. Wall Street is being revalued at its real price, and all the fake is being filtered out. Okay, yeah, that's great, but this is still real harm for real people. And to say that this is somehow punishing the professional class more than it's punishing the working class who now can't afford food.
Right.
Who already couldn't afford rent and now can't afford food either.
Right. And whose children are getting locked up at an ever increasing rate.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's like
And who now risk being deported even if they're citizens.
right. 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 And I mean, I think you know, I I was on a show the other day with Jane Miller, who used to be a sort of investigative reporter and a radio host here, and now she has her own independent podcast. And she was asking me about this stat about Democrats being at 27% approval at a nationwide level, and I guess it's actually gone down since then a little bit. But it is like, yeah, because that shit that you all are selling is not working, and everybody understands that, and everybody understands. Like at this point, the Democrats have become so status quo and institutionalized that they have allowed the MAGA wing of the Republican Party to become the transgressive political voice in America. And that is not okay, right? Like we cannot cede that space to the MAGAs, the white nationalists, and the techno-libertarians.
The transgressive voice in America can't be a mouthpiece for the most privileged people in America.
Right. Right. And that's where we are right now, though, right?
Yeah.
Because the Democrats are consistently a party of the status quo at this point. And for an increasing number of people, the status quo is untenable and not working. And the fact that they can't get through with their heads that status quo is not working for most of the people who used to be their base, even if it is working for their professional and consulting class. Like they're going to keep losing, and they're going to keep opening the door for fascism to push us further and further to the right.
This abundance movement that you're seeing Democratic quote unquote intellectuals like Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias pushing is just a repackaging of MAGA in Democratic Party language that sounds liberal. But these real estate and tech billionaires pushing it in San Francisco are the people who basically turned San Francisco into a MAGA city while still being officially liberal Democrats.
Right. It's like imagine the Cato Institute, but blue,
Yeah. Well, that's the Niskanen Institute, the Cato Institute, but blue. That's where Matt Iglesias comes from.
Yep. And it's like, okay, fine. Like, and like, I kind of expect, I actually think it wouldn't be a bad development in American politics if Andrew Yang and the Forward folks picked up on that and sort of made that their economic policy.
Fundamental joke, since you mentioned the Forward Party.
Yeah.
David Jolly is allegedly seeking to become a Democrat to run for governor of Florida. Mm-hmm. So the Forward Party may not be moving forward anymore if David Jolly is looking at becoming a Democrat for his run for governor.
I mean, we'll see.
Because he had joined up with Yang and made a big deal about his affiliation with the Forward Party for a little while.
Yeah, and in Utah they fused with the Utah United Party last week. In Maryland they're trying to get ballot access, and Pennsylvania they have ballot access. And I think the difference with Forward, and I work with Forward people here, so I like those folks a lot. But like when you have a backer behind you like Andrew Yang, you can approach ballot access differently than you have to approach it when you're a grassroots party like the Green Party.
True.
So the Green Party has to run top of the ticket races because that's how we have to get our ballot access in a decent number of states. That is not necessarily always the most strategic thing for us to do in the short term, but without the kind of resources that a billionaire tech bro has backing the party, we have to do it because that's what the law says right now. Yang can afford to skirt that. Yang can say, we're not running a presidential candidate here, and we're just going to pay for the petition drive. We're going to professionalize the petition drive in order to get on. And that gives them strategic ability to move at a state level in a way that your left, independent, and grassroots parties don't have. So I would not be surprised to see over the course of the next decade a decent number of Forward Party folks get into state legislators, right? Like I think that's a place where they could actually do pretty well, pretty effectively, arguing for this moderation perspective, arguing, to return democracy to the people. And there's some stuff that I really disagree with them on. There's some stuff that I think they can do better than No Labels could do. Like I think they're a little bit more genuine about their political purposes than No Labels was, but they kind of occupy the same space.
Yes.
Um,
They were looking at fusing with No Labels if No Labels formed a party to run a presidential candidate at one point.
Yeah, and I mean in Maryland they endorsed Larry Hogan in the Senate race, but Larry Hogan is the perfect forward party person.
Yeah, because he's a Republican with an undeserved reputation for being liberal.
Right. Now, look, at the same time, I think the Forward Party in Maryland is supporting the May Day March that we have coming up. So it is like the way that I look at a multi-party, for me, it goes in two steps. We need to have a multi-party system, and we need to have a grassroots left party in that multi-party system that, for me, is the Green Party. Right? It doesn't have to be the Green Party. It can be a different party in different places. We have a ballot line here, and places where the Green Party doesn't have a ballot line and Workers United wants to get one, great, go for it. Right? But like I think the first part of that proposition is we need a multi-party system. The second part of that proposition is, and it needs a strong, independent, grassroots left anchor to it, so that it doesn't become a three-party system where Forward is in the Joe Manchin role, but instead there is more like a five-party or five-column system. You have your left, your institutional Democrats, your Forwardists, your institutional Republicans, and your Libertarians, or something like that. So I don't have one thing about running this race is I don't have time to be super mad at anybody. I have time to figure out where people are doing good things and how I can plug in with them on that.
Yeah.
But not time to be like, damn you, Forward Party X, Y, and Z. Plenty of people will do that. And that is fine and productive. But for me, it's like, hey, Forward Party, how can we sync up so that we can build a multi-party Maryland that breaks free from Democratic supermajority since 1866. We can get back to that in a second. But how can we build this new system that makes democracy better, more participatory, more grassroots, and where there's more competition so the legislators and electeds are more accountable to voters?
And this is just why we needed to have reconstruction in states that didn't secede too. That if you really look at the numbers, Maryland having a Democratic majority since 1866.
Right.
Well, what happened in 1865 again?
Well, right. So 1864. So Maryland not subject to Maryland not subject to Emancipation Proclamation.
Exactly.
Because it's a northern state, even though it had, or a union state, even though I think there were 80,000 people enslaved in the state of Maryland at the start of the Civil War.
Yes.
Right. And so Maryland
slavery was institutional to the industrial economy of Baltimore, which is just
right. And so Maryland, not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment passes, and Maryland passes constitutional amendment in 1864 to end the institution of slavery in the state of Maryland. That Constitution in 1864 also took the Confederates and the Confederate sympathizers out of government and made it so that the non-voting freed men and women on the Eastern Shore and in Southern Maryland did not count for apportionment of legislative seats. So Maryland sort of begins its Reconstruction in 1864 with its own state constitution put on by sort of Unionists and Republicans. Yes. By 1866, the Democrats have won back control of the House and won back control of the governor's office. And by 1867, they have rolled back the apportionment things that allowed the slaveholding counties to have to have their power taken away. They have allowed Confederates back into power, and so from 1867 forward, the white Democrats who were sometimes Confederates themselves and often Confederate supporters, are back in control of Maryland's government.
Yep.
And so our Reconstruction is really truncated to about 2 years, right? And we're not subject to the Reconstruction laws of the federal government. We don't sign the 14th and the 15th Amendment. And the existing power structure consolidates itself again pretty quickly. So, like, Reconstruction in Maryland did not have the federal imposition that it had in the South. And that also meant that it didn't have as strong of a reclamation movement against it. But it did mean the Democrats were back in control of a state that was the slaveholding state going into the Civil War by 1866, and have been in control ever since. Have been in control ever since. Maryland is probably, maybe Delaware, but Maryland and Delaware are probably the only states where Democrats got in control in 1866 and have stayed in control since then.
Yeah, because Virginia's had a lot of Republican interruptions since the Southern strategy and the sort of realignment of the parties.
Right. And so Maryland is probably the place where the party realignment didn't change who was in power.
Well, Maryland and Delaware are some of the, Maryland, never really realigned. All the Maryland Democrats were rather conservative. I mean, there's a time, as scary it is to think, that no less of a reactionary than why can't I get his name out of my head right now?
Agnew?
Yes, no less a reactionary than Spiro Agnew was considered ahead of most of the Democrats in Maryland on civil rights when he became governor.
Yeah, yep. And it's interesting because now Maryland has a Black governor, an Indian American lieutenant governor, a Black attorney general, a Black speaker of the House, and the largest legislative Black caucus of any state in the country. And we have some of the most progressive counties in the country, in Montgomery County and in Howard County, and a lot of their policies, and in Prince George's County to some degree. And Democrats have a veto-proof majority in both houses, and have had a veto-proof majority in both houses of the legislature for like a century, right? And so it is like, as a whole, often relatively conservative, but plenty of progressive people make up that Democratic Party, and so it's an interesting institution. And I think the fact that Reconstruction was run by the states and co-opted by the Democrats relatively quickly tells a lot of the story of what has happened in Maryland since 1866.
Yes.
I
think that's tremendously important. I think it's also tremendously important when you remember that the poorest parts of Appalachia were the most pro-union parts of the South, and in some cases the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And the poorest parts of Appalachia just happened to be punished for supporting the Union and opposing slavery with grinding generational poverty.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about like who the land owning, property owning, slavery or enslavement class of Democrats was who took back power in 1866, who else did they not like other than newly freed people? They didn't like immigrant workers in Baltimore. They didn't like Appalachian workers in Western Maryland. They didn't like, they didn't like the people who supported the federal government around D.C. So at that time in the 1867 Constitution, which is the current Constitution of Maryland, by the way, right? It has been amended, surely, but at that time, it wasn't just anti-Black; it was anti-labor, and it was anti-industrial labor in Baltimore and anti-Appalachian labor in the West. And so you start to get this state where, untouched by Reconstruction, what ends up happening is, instead of the state fostering independent Black institutions and then them getting crushed, it was kind of like pretty quickly going to happen that there was not going to be federal intervention, there was not going to be state intervention. So in Baltimore, in the Eastern Shore, and out west, you started to get these independent union and Black workers collectives and things like that happening that created this sort of civic culture, civic labor culture, and civic Black culture in Maryland, despite Democratic control and independent of Democratic control. And I think, I saw a movie the other night that was about the Baltimore uprising 10 years later. And the point that it was making was the reason that the uprising was different in Baltimore than it was in Ferguson or than it was in anywhere else was because there was a long existing indigenous Black movement culture in Baltimore and in Maryland that had to spring up because of the experience since 1866, basically.
Yeah. The Democratic Party and even all the members of the biggest Black caucus in the country are still part of that institutional system that is not supportive of any sort of workers' movement, especially a Black workers' movement.
Right. And so you look at the Baltimore uprising, and what happens in the Baltimore uprising is all the people who are already doing the work in Baltimore shifted their attention to Freddie Gray, shifted their attention to police brutality, shifted their attention to those type of things. And you had folks coming in from out of state that were like, oh, let us tell you what we did in Ferguson. And they're like, bro, we don't need you. Right? Like we've got this. We've been doing this in Baltimore. We have an established Black civic culture, Black civic society, and we don't need the outsiders who have learned how to protest from some training because we have generations of indigenous movements for that. And I think the movie was called Baltimore Still Rises, and it was put out by the Baltimore Legacy Project. And it was great. We actually got to go to like a big old theater to watch it. And it's so nice to watch a movement-based independent film in a theater instead of like in a church basement projected on a white concrete wall or something,
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that is so exciting about getting to do this campaign is that I get to focus so much on Maryland, right? Like I get to have like a master's thesis level of research on Maryland history, on Maryland politics, and just not have to be distracted by what's happening around the country, around the world. It's like we still pay attention to that stuff, but I've got a good reason to stay focused on Maryland and how those things affect Maryland. And I just love getting to dive into the history, getting to talk to the people who understand the things, getting that tidbit from somebody who will be like, well, what you should really look into is the 1864 Constitution and the 1867 Constitution. Fascinating stuff. And I was like, okay, well, let me go check it out, so.
It's like one of the things that I will always remember is reading the biography of Thaddeus Stevens, who was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee during Radical Reconstruction and was the driving force beyond the idea that we could actually reconstruct the South and make it better than it had been. Lived long enough to lay dying after having heard that the Pennsylvania state election had voted down a constitutional amendment that would have let Black people vote in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And Thaddeus Stevens said, as he lay there dying, my whole life has been a failure.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to look at and what was lost in the opportunity of Reconstruction as we think about what a new Reconstruction looks like. Now that the federal jobs, now that deindustrialization has occurred, the end of agricultural economies has occurred, and now the end of the federal economy has occurred in Maryland. It might be time to start thinking about what happened in periods of previous Reconstruction and think about like what.
And let's not forget, in this age of the MAGA movement, and Democrats seem to be unwilling to face this, and of course you have to draw the line between what's the appropriate amount of anti-Nazi authoritarianism and where is all authoritarianism bad. But It's important to understand that a big part of Reconstruction was the idea that they could, for lack of a better word, denazify the Confederate society, the formerly Confederate society, and create a new Southern society that was built on this idea of racial equality.
Yep.
That didn't exist anywhere else in the United States. They were deliberately trying to create it in the South so that it could then be exported.
Yep.
And I think that any sort of look at Reconstruction is going to have to consider, well, how do we then denazify our ruling class culture in the wake of these large numbers of people on both sides who are willing to see people deported if, it follows the rule of law.
Right.
I mean,
or if it doesn't. Right.
That was an important thing in the Holocaust is, early on when they were trying to get buy-in from the official German government Republican process for what became the Holocaust, Hitler had judges working on how to make the Holocaust conform with the German rule of law so that people wouldn't be threatened too fast.
Right.
And it seems like all the Democrats really want to do is make sure that whatever bad stuff is going to happen conforms to that rule of law.
Right. And I mean, and again, it's like going back to this Van Hollen answer, you know, and it is like, and it's like, sure, I understand you're a United States senator. You can't say, I don't accept the judge's ruling, right? Like, I understand the political position he's in on that. And Dana Bash kept asking him, she kept saying, like, so if he gets brought back to this country and a judge like says that he should be sent back to El Salvador, are you back to this prison in El Salvador, are you okay with that? And he's like, I will accept whatever happens via the rule of law. And it is like, no, like, you got to say, like, you got to have a more nuanced answer than that. And I think it can say, like, look, while the judge's decision is final, this government should not have a contract with El Salvador.
At a time of runaway sports gambling in the past, a commissioner of baseball once took baseball's reputation so seriously that he issued a declaration saying, regardless of the ruling of courts, nobody who has ever been accused of any sort of untowardness will ever play ball in my league again.
Right. And I mean, that kind of boldness, we can agree or not agree with that commissioner of baseball, but there's a place for that kind of boldness. And that boldness is lacking in Democratic politics right now.
But his boldness was also dictated by what he saw as political necessity. To save baseball, he had to make this stance that we were purer than Caesar's wife.
Yeah.
That we're not even going to tolerate the appearance of anything bad. Now, of course, baseball isn't like that anymore.
No.
Which is sort of hilarious because they won't unban Pete Rose, but people are getting away with unbelievable crap now.
Yeah. No, and I mean, like, professional sports is increasingly a billionaire's game.
Professional sports has been like the place where every billionaire gets to play king. And now as a result, all these other billionaires who don't have sports teams want to find some way to be able to play king themselves at the expense of the people and the government.
Yep. And it's like, look, I mean, Maryland is not chock full of billionaires, right?
True.
Like, we have a lot of millionaires. We have a much higher.
How many billionaire investments do you have, though?
We got a decent amount, and the Orioles might be one of them. Our sports teams are certainly up there. We have plenty of billion-dollar government investments. We have plenty of people who are building new things.
Because ultimately the big question isn't how many billionaires do you have, but where is the billionaire capital invested in your state?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's invested in, I would say for the most part, it is invested in the core urban areas,
Yeah.
and the gentrifying parts of the core urban areas and the suburban areas,
The real estate and service industry in the urban growth market.
Yeah, and I would say in addition to that, all the aerospace and military
Yeah.
stuff, all of the technology. So there's a Maryland Israel Development Center,
Oh, yes, of course.
where we have a joint venture. Maryland as a state has a joint venture with the state of Israel to support industry in Maryland that works for Israeli companies. A lot of those are surveillance. A lot of those are security. And it's interesting because people will say, "Okay, that's happening over there, but what does it have to do with Maryland?" And it is
Israel is such a great way for U.S. billionaires to launder money.
Yeah.
AIPAC comes to mind.
Yep.
Because AIPAC, all that money, I mean, people talk about foreign interference, and I get that up to a point, but AIPAC's money is not coming from Israel. AIPAC's money is coming from America through very specific sources, which include, on the one hand, Christian billionaires, and on the other hand, a lot of grassroots donations from institutional cultural groups that are aligned with American capital and pro-Israel politics.
Have you seen the Israelism documentary?
I don't think I have.
It's worth watching. I think it's one of those movies that I saw in a library projected off of somebody's laptop onto a projector screen. But it's worth watching to understand the way that particular arrangement that you just talked about has instantiated itself into universities, into advocate organizations, and into government.
Well, when I think of the word Zionism, I don't even think of contemporary Jewish settler colonialism in Palestine first, which is almost sounds weird. But when I think of Zionism, the first thing I think of is the language of the Pilgrims settling in Massachusetts in the 1600s, who are already talking about building a city on a hill that will be a new Jerusalem to bring God's new kingdom into the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was the language of the early settlers of what's now New England.
Mm-hmm.
That this was going to be this holy place that would be the second Jerusalem and where Christ's kingdom would be on earth.
Yeah,
that's what I think of when I think of Zionism. It was American first, and it justified manifest destiny.
Yeah. And how's that working out, right?
Well, it ended up favoring a whole lot of rich people who invested in real estate early enough. I mean, there's this great, the guy who wrote it isn't even a socialist. He's just a liberal historian. But the book is called Surveying America. And it's about the main character, protagonist, anti-hero, whatever, is the guy Andrew Ellicott, the guy who surveyed DC. But what he's less famous, but more important for, is the fact that he was the original surveyor of what we would call the Northwest Territory, what we would call the Ohio Territory, and what they then called the Northwest Territory. And there was an immense amount of corruption in how the lots that were surveyed by Mr. Ellicott in the field went through the hands of people in Congress to then be sold as real estate to the most popular supporters of various people in Congress.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating.
Excellent. Yeah. You'll have to send me that.
There are actually stories about how local militias would try to threaten him to affect the way he drew his lines in order to benefit the local gentry as opposed to the Washington real estate speculators.
Yeah, it's almost as if some of these things are through lines throughout American and European
But it's like
history.
there's this real estate scam in the very first Western expansion of the United States. There's a real estate scam.
Yeah, yeah, not shocking in the least, right? Like,
And remember that this whole Western expansion was based on the need to genocide people in
right.
exactly the same way that Israel's imagined expansion into the West Bank and Gaza is based on the need to get rid of Palestinians.
Yep. And empty, and myths of empty land, myths of uncivilized people, all of
Empty
these.
land, uncivilized people. These are very useful labels for people who want to take the land and do something bad to the people if they won't go along with it.
Yep, absolutely. And it's like, I think uncovering these through lines is almost always useful. And I think it helps people to understand so much of how we, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with this campaign is how do we have deeper conversations around political education so that we're not accepting the sound bitification of American democracy, because I think that sound bitification of American democracy serves both parties lack of desire to deal with substance, to deal with history, and to deal with specifics. And so all the time people will say to me, like, you need to, hey, that's a great hour and a half long podcast you did, but do you have a 30-second version of it? And I got some folks who are helping me to make 30-second clips here and there. And I'm always surprised by my ability to deliver in a 30-second clip. But at the same time, I'm going to keep doing the long form stuff. I'm going to keep doing the historical exposition, because I think that we can't surrender the deep thought and deep conversation to the right. I mean, look at how long Joe Rogan's podcasts are, right?
4 hours.
Right.
There's a reason I'm sitting here having real conversations that tend to go anywhere from an hour to 4 hours, depending on how long other people are able to talk to me.
Absolutely. And for me, it's essential to fight back against that sound bitification of politics. I was thinking about this earlier, like, in the 1950s, coming out of World War II, the two-party system as we know it today was set up with the idea that sort of both parties were non-ideological, and that they would come to compromise about specific differences. And so it was set up to incentivize specifics and to de-incentivize ideology, right?
Well, and both parties agreed on, U.S. supremacy around the world.
Right.
White supremacy at home for the most part. The last gasp of, and he was ironically tremendously racist, but the last gasp of any effort for the Republicans to be an anti-white supremacy party was when Theodore Roosevelt had Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House.
Right.
And there was so much public backlash to that Teddy Roosevelt never tried to do anything publicly anti-racist again for the rest of the time he was president.
And you come to the 1950s, you come to the invention of the two-party system, and there's an acceptance of a set of ideological constraints. There's an acceptance of U.S. dominance, there's an acceptance of capitalism, there's an acceptance of growth, and there's an acceptance of American-style democracy over Soviet communism. Right.
And there's an acceptance, I will say this, especially by the time of the 1960s, there's an acceptance of Booker T. Washington in order to demonize Martin Luther King.
Right.
Just as now we see the acceptance of Martin Luther King in order to demonize more demanding Black leaders now.
Right. And so I think the two-party system is set up in ideal theory to focus on specific policy disagreements between the parties and not to focus on ideological distinctions. And it is now broken, irredeemably broken, and it focuses on no policy specifics and only focuses on ideological clash. And so, like, one of the things that I'm increasingly thinking is valuable about third parties is that they can break through the mutually beneficial debate about ideology and whether we should or shouldn't do things, and start talking about specific ways to do things, and start talking about specific solutions to those problems. I've been talking about reparations a lot recently because there's a bill in Maryland to create a reparations commission. Green Party has supported reparations for 25 years. It's been in our platform. So I really hope that the governor signs it and we can have a debate about it during the 2026 election. But without us in that debate, what you get is a debate about whether reparations should happen. And you get a debate about whether reparations should happen where liberals will say, of course, we need to do something about the incalculable harm of slavery. And Republicans say it'll cost too much and we shouldn't be responsible for the past.
And liberals will sort of say, well, we agree it probably will cost too much.
Right.
And sort of sacrifice some ground right up front. But we have to do this anyway.
Right, but not actually. They're not actually interested in doing it.
Exactly,
they're just interested in calling for it.
Well, that's why they'll sacrifice the high ground right up front, saying it probably will cost too much.
Yeah,
but we have to do this anyway, and then never getting around to doing it.
Or it's incalculable, right?
Yes,
they will say it is incalculable to repair the psychic damage of enslavement in the United States, and that probably is true. Right. But there are real actuarial harms that happen to real people as a result of state and federal and local policy. And those things can be calculated and those things can be recompensated.
I reference this book a lot because it has so many things that are worth referencing. And it's such a shame that Stephen King became such a disappointing, phony resistance liberal. But that said, in The Stand, when they're introducing the character of Mother Abigail and explaining her biography and the history of her family, the history of her family starts after the Civil War with her father owning a substantial amount of land and being a member of the Grange, the first black member of the Grange in that part of Nebraska. And then it becomes a story of her brothers and husbands losing more and more and more of that land until in the end, all that they have is a farmhouse and a few fields. Yeah. And so they were at the high point after the Civil War. They fell to this regressive low point where they lost everything they gained. Their family had no ability to carry down the kind of generational wealth that white farmers in the same situation were able to do. And they ended up losing everything.
Yeah. And, it's like, look, we will see if Westmore signs this bill. Remember, we've talked about Westmore having to run against Larry Hogan. We've talked about Westmore running for president. Go ahead.
But the point of that, I'm sorry, I got sidetracked. The point of that, though, is that the damage done really was economic damage.
Right.
And it wasn't just at the end of slavery. It was also these people who got things because of the end of slavery, losing everything again back to white people because of capitalism.
Right. And look, there are, when I will have this argument with conservatives and MAGA types, they will say race-based solutions are illegal.
Yes.
The Supreme Court said so. And it is like, sir, we are not talking about a race-based solution. We are talking about actuarial assessment of specific damage done to specific people by specific sets of government policy, and then figuring out what it takes to remedy that. And it is like, the fact that there is a racist policy does not mean that the reparation for the people affected by it is a race-based policy.
And of course, the joke about liberals saying it is incalculable is that it is a liberal show, The West Wing, in which the great actor Carl Lumbly reminds us that no, a scholar actually put an exact calculation on what reparations should be based on the money of the time and the inflation for that point in time when that episode of The West Wing aired.
Right.
So it's not incalculable. People calculated it.
And so look, I think there is certain actuarial things that should be handled in an actuarial way, and the state
Yes.
should figure out, especially a state like Maryland, which did not have federal Reconstruction and took it upon itself to truncate
Yes.
Reconstruction. A state like Maryland should figure out what it would take to calculate that and the impact that it would have on closing the black wealth gap in the
My
state.
favorite Maryland story is that Francis Scott Key's grandson was arrested by Abraham Lincoln's Pinkertons and locked up for being a Confederate sympathizer.
Yeah, I mean,
my favorite Washington, D.C. story is that while no one has ever shot anybody on Fifth Avenue in New York, a New York congressman named Daniel Sickles shot Francis Scott Key's son in Lafayette Square in D.C.
Fair enough. I did not know that.
It was a big deal. He did this while sitting in Congress not too long after running for re-election, and he actually ended up becoming the popular hero of the story despite being the murderer.
And it ain't that America, right?
And then he became a borderline war hero in the Civil War, losing a leg at Gettysburg.
Fascinating. Yeah, no, I did not know that. So I want to go back to this reparations question for a second, because while there's a part of it that is calculable, right, and we should calculate that, and we should figure out what some type of monetary recompense looks like for that. There are other parts of it that are reasonably difficult to call calculable. The damage that was done to communities through the war on drugs, the manage that was done to, so when the war on drugs was fought against cities like Baltimore and against Black people in places like Baltimore, it was not just fought against the people. It had effects beyond those who were incarcerated, beyond those who were victims of police brutality, that entirely destabilized civic culture and communities and entirely destroyed Black institutions that were reliant on those people who may have also gone to the church but been involved in drug sales. And that is harder to calculate. And so in Maryland, in addition, we already have these things called the Community Repair and Reinvestment Funds, where they take a certain chunk of the cannabis taxation, and they give them to an independent commission run by each county, whose job is to figure out how to invest in indigenous Black community-led organizations that are going to begin to repair the civic society. Because you can give people cash in whatever way possible, but if the entire structure of where they live is a white supremacist capitalist society designed to extract that cash from them, you're not transitioning that process. So while we can calculate the specific harm that was done to specific people, and we should have a cash or monetary payment element for that, we should also invest more progressive taxation money into these locally controlled community repair and reinvestment funds that can do an end run around the nonprofit industrial complex and the philanthropic industrial complex.
Community chests need more money, and that's a simple way to put it, and that's true everywhere.
Yep. And then the third thing that is the spiritual. And some of the spiritual and sacred spaces that have been destroyed in Maryland as a result of white supremacist policy. So we work closely with the Bethesda Africa Cemetery Coalition, who is the descendants of a Black community on River Road in Bethesda, Maryland, which is now like a Whole Foods, a community with a Whole Foods and $1 million homes. They had a church and a cemetery on that land. The Montgomery County owns most of that land on top of their cemetery right now, and refuses Supreme Court cases, all sorts of court cases, years of fighting. Democrats in Montgomery County refuse to make that right by the descendants of that cemetery. So that type of thing is like, yeah, we need to return the land, right? Like the county is in possession of the land, and the county can be made to give the land back. Right. The county can be made to give the land back to the community. And that is an actuarial harm. They took the land and they built over it. But the destruction of the cemetery is a spiritual thing that no amount of money is going to recover. And so maybe you take some money from the community repair and reinvestment fund and you invest in a nonprofit or an organization that aims to connect the descendants. For example, the Bethesda Africa Cemetery Coalition is trying to build a museum on that space that explains the Black history of that part of Montgomery County. And so, like, what does reparations look like in this case? One, it looks like giving them the land back. Two, giving them economic damages for having taken the land. Three, helping to use some technical skills to make sure the descendants of their ancestors are not under a parking lot anymore.
Yeah.
And four, investing in something that allows Black people and Black communities to tell the story that they had there, that the white Democrats and developers sought to erase. And, you know, so when people ask me what reparations look like, it's like, it looks like that. It looks like identifying a specific harm, finding the people who were harmed and their descendants, and figuring out a way to A, do the actuarial work, B, do the organizational development work, and C, allow the spiritual healing that the state and the county have prevented from happening.
It's just interesting. I was talking about Zionism being American and parallels between here and there. And it just brings to mind the fact, when you said it's under a Whole Foods now, it brings to mind the fact that during the Deir Yassin massacre in the 47-48 Israeli war, the people who came and stopped the massacre were Arab Jews from a nearby settlement who had been in Palestine for a long time. And the neighborhood that those Arab Jews who went to stop the Deir Yassin massacre lived in is now under a very upper class suburb of Jerusalem where only the most well-off European settlers can afford to live.
Right. And you know, colonialism identifies the land as empty, as worthless, and seizes it because it actually knows that it is occupied and worth plenty.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that connection runs through that. That is colonialism, whether it is Black people in the in Maryland, you know, whether it is in Gaza or the West Bank, or whether it is in the Ohio Territory.
How many indigenous American burial grounds have been just built over casually?
Right.
I mean, that used to be a trope in serial fiction, or where, you know, there would be an indigenous American group protesting construction at a specific place because it was their spiritual site or their graveyard. That was a trope in the culture of the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah,
for a reason, because we've destroyed so many of those sites.
And it became legislation largely to protect indigenous sites, right? So you know, and so, I mean, we need similar legislation to protect Black burial sites and Black funerary objects. And, you know, a lot of these states where they do have these types of legislation have these things where you need to show the deed for the grave or whatever. Well, that doesn't work if it is a small community's church that does not require you to purchase a deed in order to have access to the grave, right?
Well, and that's the whole thing. The reason that they can just destroy this quote unquote empty land is because the web of the capitalist web of proof of ownership that would exist for a white cemetery that was probably opened by somebody who started a forest lawn franchise in 1950. That's not going to be there at a community church cemetery that was built in, 1899.
Especially in a world where in 1899, in a lot of places, a Black cemetery would not have been allowed to get those
They wouldn't have been allowed to have deeds. Yeah.
Right. You know, and so you end up in this thing where it is like the law is set up to require things that are, and look, there are some African and Black cemeteries that do have those things, but there are others that are not going to, and there are indigenous cultures that are not going to. And we need to, when we think about reparations, we need to think about enslavement, we need to think about Jim Crow, we need to think about redlining, but we need to think about all of the things that entailed, not just the sort of surface level pieces of that. One of the interesting parts of this as it relates to Maryland is when people are looking for a descendant tree metric to use to decide who's eligible for reparations, one of the ones that they often cite is whether you attended a segregated school. And great, okay, I think that's an interesting metric and I think it's useful. And at the same time, there are parts of Southern Maryland, Western Maryland, and Prince George's County where there were no segregated schools for Black people until 1880s, 1890s, things like that.
Yeah.
So even the metric that would often be used in order to determine that would exclude people who were at the worst part of, who were dealing with the worst part of the racist society at the time. And so for me, like when I think about what that metric is, it is either you were a descendant of somebody who attended a segregated school, or you were a descendant of somebody who was unable to attend schools because schools were segregated and your county or jurisdiction did not have a school that allowed Black people to be educated.
And there were, and how do you define segregated? New York didn't have Jim Crow laws, but at the same time, New York had segregated schools.
And I mean,
still does.
I'm not running for governor of New York, so I don't have to answer that question. But in Maryland, we did have formally segregated schools.
Yes.
And in many counties, there were not schools for high school aged, for high school and middle school aged Black children. And so you had a situation where schools were forced to be segregated, and there were no public schools for the Black students.
Yes.
And it was because they had reached laboring age in those former plantation counties, and they would rather those counties and the white landowners would rather them go to work than be educated.
One of the valuable socio-cultural moments in Ken Burns baseball is when Buck O'Neill talks about growing up in working class Black Florida, which means agricultural labor. No school for him to go to past a certain age. And so at that age, he went out and picked celery with his dad.
Yeah.
And he didn't like it.
Right.
He's like, well, what else am I supposed to do? I mean, is there anything else but this stupid celery field? And his father says, there is, but not here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so then you see all of these various great migrations that occur.
Mm-hmm.
And in Maryland, those great migrations occurred because of lack of opportunity and because of mob violence out of the Southern Maryland counties and out of the Eastern Shore. Oftentimes they came to Baltimore, and in Western Maryland it occurred where folks went to Pittsburgh and folks went to Cleveland and maybe folks went to Buffalo and things like that.
Lots of people went to the District of Columbia. There's a reason that people call DC Chocolate City. Yeah,
and so in addition to talking about Reconstruction and reparation as part of our campaign, we're also going to talk about the right of return. We're going to talk about people who were descendants of those who were freed in this state, who were forced to flee this state, and who were forced to go elsewhere, either for economic opportunity or because they were driven out by white racist mobs supported by Democratic politicians and developers. And so it's interesting because when I say we're going to do this like solidarity economy, we're going to have public banks, we're going to have co-ops, we're going to have progressive taxation, we're going to do this reparation, we're going to do all this stuff. People are like, well, I'm leaving the state of Maryland and moving to Virginia. And I'm like, it is right over there. We will gladly rebuild this state with descendants of freed people who are coming back here in order to seize the opportunity that was never given to them. So see ya. It's right over the river. It's an hour away in that direction. Enjoy Virginia.
Now you see, and here's where you have some sort of exit control. Whereas, okay, if you're fleeing Maryland to avoid the consequences of land redistribution for purposes of reparations, you don't actually that doesn't stop us from grabbing the land.
Right. Like look, I mean, this whole, aside from the conversation of reparations, this whole right-wing threat to move to Virginia is a big part of how the Republicans, the independents, and the conservatives are navigating the need to increase taxes in the state of Maryland.
Yes.
We passed a $30 billion decade-long education plan 5 years ago. And when we passed it, the budget people and the state government said, you're going to have to raise income taxes, property taxes, and sales taxes to pay for this because it's $30 billion, right? And the Democrats at the time said, no, we don't have to do any of that. So what did they do? They decided to spend 4 or 5 years increasing service fees, increasing, kickers on taxes, increasing this, increasing that, increasing the other. But that doesn't make up the $30 billion gap. And at the time, progressive taxation advocates were like, you are going to have to raise the top income tax brackets and you're going to have to raise everybody's tax bracket. And when that happened in 1999 and in 2019 and 2020, there was polling support for progressive taxation at about 65% to pay for the new education program. But they didn't want to do it because they were afraid that it would lose them some electoral seats in 2022 and they wouldn't be able to win the governor's mansion. And then in 2023, they didn't want to do it because they were afraid Larry Hogan was going to run for Senate. In 2024, they didn't want to do it because they were afraid Larry Hogan was going to run for Senate. And now they have to do it this year because there's a $3 billion deficit. And we're not the federal government. We can't print money. We have to balance the budget. So what do we get this year? We get a cobbled together sort of progressive taxation on people making over $500,000 a year, which great, like tax the 1%. But it is no longer a 1% question in a place like Maryland. It is like a 20% question. 20% of the wealth needs to pay for the 80% of the wealth type of question. And so while this progressive taxation that they did pass this year might have been good 5 years ago, it's way too little too late 5 years later when it is just like a half point increase on people who are making over $500,000 a year, And so, but I say all that to say that alone has caused a bunch of these MAGA and conservative and independent folks to say that I'm leaving the state, I'm moving to Virginia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for many of the Democrats, the answer is, no, we need you to stay here, don't leave, like we'll figure it out. And my answer is, fine, it's right over there. It's an hour ride away. We'll see you when you come up for Orioles games. But like,
I feel like,
leave, go ahead.
I feel like the need to be able to do something about funding just raises more good arguments for state banks.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's why, we're a big part of what we're going to push for is a Maryland Public Bank. Maryland Public Bank, an increased number of worker cooperatives, an increased amount of municipal and democratic ownership, public utilities instead of private monopolies. I think manufacturing incentives for people who start businesses in Maryland, not manufacturing incentives to lure Volvo to Hagerstown for 5 years so they stay there until the tax credit runs out and then they cut all the jobs. It's like we need.
Like, yeah, what good does it do to give somebody Volvo jobs for 5 years? I mean, what happens after those 5 years?
Right. They've either done a good job of setting up and there's a lot of jobs dependent on it, so they have to keep getting the tax breaks, or they don't get the tax breaks and they go to Alabama.
But if you set them up to keep getting the tax breaks, then you never benefit from then the community never benefits from those jobs the way it's supposed to, because Absolutely. You're giving that company those tax breaks. Because Absolutely. That tax money from that company is in theory the benefit of having the company come and create jobs.
Right, exactly. Right. And it's like one thing, okay, fine, we'll tax the workers. No problem. Tax the workers. They got good jobs, tax them, of course. Right. But you've got to tax the company too. You can't let the company be like, we are leaving unless you give us a tax break.
If we're taxing workers and in order to give tax breaks to companies, that means our workers are paying for their bosses' tax breaks. That's the redistribution of wealth from the worker to the boss.
Absolutely. And if there's anything more, if there's anything quintessentially Maryland, it is the redistribution of wealth from workers to their bosses, right? And I don't think it's unique to Maryland, but it is very particular in Maryland because, again, as of 1866, the landowning class that got us into had a system based on slavery, was put back in power, and has stayed in power until today.
Hey, it's worth noting. I mean, I mentioned the family generations of Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key, his son who got shot by the congressman, and his grandson who was arrested for being a Confederate sympathizer, were all the U.S. attorney for Maryland. Francis Scott Key was the first U.S. attorney for Maryland, and it became hereditary in his family to some degree. Both his son and his grandson were the U.S. attorney for Maryland. Philip Barton Key was the U.S. attorney for Maryland when Daniel Sickles shot him.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that politics has to be a place where we tell these stories. And I think the two-party system has gotten itself into a system where this is not the type of conversation we have as part of politics. We don't talk about history. We don't talk about Reconstruction, and not just Reconstruction as it relates to 1860, but Reconstruction as in envisioning a new world that we use the power of government in order to move us toward. And so, for me, one of the things that I think we're in a really precarious position in Maryland because of the attacks on the federal government and because of our dependence on the federal government. And I think when we go into the 2026 election, the Democrats are going to talk about going back to 2023 before Trump. And the Republicans are going to talk about going back to 2019 when Larry Hogan was in power again. And wouldn't it be nice? And both of them are going to sort of revert to a wistful look back at a time when Maryland was an upper middle class state, entirely dependent on the federal government, and everybody was comfortable and unemployment was low and that type of thing. I don't think that world's coming back. And I think that we need to envision what the Maryland we want to live in 10 years from now looks like, and then start building it. And for me, that looks like more worker ownership, more public ownership, more democracy, more redistribution of power and wealth to workers, and less distribution of power and wealth to industrialists and bosses. Less attempts to try to use tax breaks to lure out-of-state corporations into town, and more incentive to try to grow and locally owned, democratically controlled, worker-owned businesses that have a reason to stay here. Like, if we're going to use tax breaks in order to build business and in order to spur industrial growth, let's at least spur it amongst people who are in Maryland, who are willing to follow our environmental standards, who are willing to allow workers to own things, and who are willing to allow us to build something better than the world that we live in right now. So I see you got a quote up here.
Yes, and this is true. This is Eugene. I'm glad Eugene is back. I hadn't seen Eugene for a little while, and I was worried. So I'm glad Eugene is okay. Industrial jobs prior to the New Deal and mass unionization, manufacturing jobs were terrible. It's true.
Absolutely.
There were horrible working conditions in many, many places. One of the things that Henry Ford used to steal workers from other employers was that he said his working conditions were just a little bit better than everybody else's, while at the same time not making them so much better that it would actually benefit the workers more than it benefited him.
Right, exactly. And like, look, that is what Trump wants to do with the jobs that he's reshoring, right? Yep. The jobs that Trump is attempting to bring back. He does not want to bring back like 1970s style robust unionism.
He wants to bring back like 1920s Dearborn.
Yeah, or whatever. I mean, he may even want to go further back than that.
So honestly, if you want my opinion.
Sure, it's your show.
It is, I guess. The joke that always comes to my mind and it's not a joke anymore. They actually want to go back to an era when Andrew Jackson was a bold progressive.
Yep.
And the only people who could vote owned property.
Right.
And the idea of even Jacksonian democracy, where every white male votes going too far, I think really fits in with MAGA when you get right down to it.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, like, let's talk about industrial jobs for a second, right? So, like, Sparrows Point, which I mentioned earlier, big union steel mill in Baltimore County, sort of the heart of thriving Maryland steel industry in a lot of ways. It is being reindustrialized, but it is mostly distribution centers. It is mostly warehouses. It is mostly logistics centers. So what we're seeing is it is being reindustrialized with lower paying non-union jobs, well, right?
Portland used to be shipyards and now it's docks.
Right. And so you get this thing where in the current paradigm, reindustrialization is heavily mechanized,
yes.
is heavily mechanized and heavily subsidized by like low, by non-unionized labor. And I think that is also not the solution to lead to reindustrialization or to have a regrowth of manufacturing as an element, or a regrowth of agriculture as an element of a new Maryland economy. And so I think what we have to think about is like, how does a public bank, a series of cooperatives, and a series of incentives for indigenous worker-owned or community-controlled business start to create an industrial base in the cities that have industrial infrastructure, right? Yeah. Like throughout Maryland, you have cities that have infrastructure designed to make things.
And I have one last question.
Yeah, sure.
That I think in this case is really, really important in the framework of Tech Bros and how they want to take our future forward.
Yeah.
Do we need to start thinking about a future where everybody works less, and that we need to think about how are we going to make industries pay society for divesting themselves of their workforce so that we can continue to support society at the sort of consumption that those businesses are going to need to survive, for even them to survive?
Yes. I mean, we need to move beyond thinking about it, and we need to think about specific solutions for it.
Yes.
Because look, like that is coming. The big corporate multinational jobs are increasingly getting thinned out, whether it's in manufacturing, agriculture, or in the service sector. Mm-hmm. So that is coming, right? Like I've been sort of wrapping my head around the fact that, like, in a state like Maryland, the Trump administration and its policies may very well force us into some period of degrowth, in which we need to start thinking about like what it looks like to have a more localized economy, a less growing economy, a more constrained economy, and things like that. And like in some ways, I think that's a real opportunity, actually. Like, not, we don't have to have like degrowth as ideological concept so much, right? Like we can have some of that discussion, but it is kind of getting forced on us by the Trump administration. And I think it gives us an opportunity to rethink how we want to situate and orient ourselves.
And the Trump administration seems to be very much redistributing wealth to more of these people who might have been slave owners before 1860.
Right. And it's like, I think there is an opportunity to use the next election not as a means of thinking about what it looks like to go back to a time where it worked better, but instead to look at like how we have a radically transformed society in a place like Maryland that used to be dependent on the federal government, but no longer can be, and now has to rethink local economies, now has to rethink how the state situates itself in relation to the federal government and multinational corporations, and has to do what it can to spur like indigenous organizations that exist outside of government or capital, as they have always had to do in the state of Maryland, especially after Democrats took back over in 1866, right? And so it's like, if we think about that tradition of Maryland to form independent institutions that are cultural, social, and institutional, despite Democrats in control of the government. I think it gives us a template for what it looks like to imagine a Maryland a decade from now that has transformed into a place that works for more people, and in which the transfer of wealth and power stops going that way and comes back down to people, communities, and cities that were devastated by deindustrialization, state and federal policy.
No, I think that's tremendously important. I was checking something because I was curious. But it's worth noting that the Blair family, who were the Republicans in 1864, became Democrats in 1866.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sort of maintained their situation in Maryland politics and economy without really changing much, despite having been gung-ho pro-Civil War Republicans for a few years.
Yeah. And I mean, there was a lot of that, right? Like, Maryland's approach to the Civil War was, can we please not, right? Like, and
well, it's like Kentucky and Missouri both attempted to declare neutrality at first, and neither side was having that.
Right, and that was going to be the case in Maryland. I mean, at least the benefit that Kentucky and Missouri had was that they did not surround Washington D.C. Right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, there was no neutral Baltimore.
Right, exactly, and so like, there's a reason that Lincoln put gunboats in Annapolis Harbor.
Lincoln sent federal troops to help the Baltimore Police Department put down the draft riots because he did not trust the Baltimore Police Department not to join the draft riots.
Right. And there's a reason that he sent federal troops and the United States Navy to Annapolis when Annapolis was voting on secession.
Yeah.
He was letting them know that there were consequences to this decision.
You guys are a little too close to D.C. for me to let you get away with anything of the sort that's going on down there in South Carolina.
Right. It was real clear. There was a real delineated find out stage that was immediate and like guns trained on you if you vote the wrong way type of thing, And so, I mean, like, and again, like Kentucky, New Jersey, Delaware, Missouri, like, had some of that, but they didn't have it to the extent that Annapolis did, because it's like on the other side of DC, Well,
it's like Missouri was ultimately ended up being in the Union primarily because one guy decided not to surrender a fort no matter what, to a degree that went even beyond the sort of show of resistance at Fort Sumter.
Yeah.
And that basically started a war in Missouri on his own authority, despite only being a captain.
Yeah, well, so I think that those are interesting tidbits. It's
actually where the Bugs Bunny line, "This means war," comes from. It's part of a longer quote where he says, "This body cannot dictate to the U.S. government, blah, blah, blah. This means war."
Yeah. And so I don't know. Like, I think, we are June 21st, we're 500 days out from the election, right? And so we're starting to get to a place where we're consolidating the strategy, we're consolidating the arguments that we're going to make, and we're consolidating what it is going to look like to run this race to the end and try to achieve a few really solid goals. One of them is to have the best performance of a third-party candidate in the state of Maryland for the governor's race since the Civil War. That's doing better than 3.5%, right? And like, you know, people will say 3.5%, that's not much. And it's like, it might not be, but in Maryland it is. And so if we can aim to do that, that's one of our main goals. A second goal is to get on the debate stage. Currently, Maryland Public Television, which receives 30% of its funding from taxpayers, excludes third-party candidates from participating in the debates they have. And while we'd love to be on the NBC debate and the Fox debate and all of that type of thing, those are private companies and whatever.
Right? I want to point this out. Public television in Maryland receives 30% of its funding from taxpayers. Now think about that. It's supposed to be public television. We're supposed to be funding it, and it only gets 30% of its funding from taxpayers.
Yeah.
Just my moment there to complain about some things.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that complaining. And look, like, I just spent $90 to the cable company in order to finally be able to watch Orioles games on a bad streaming app. And there's a part of me that says, if I were the governor and we were giving them $1.2 billion in stadium money between the Orioles and the Ravens, those games are going on Maryland public television. And, you know, like, if you know, we're going to get a Maryland public television one or Orioles digital channel, and everybody in the state can watch it, just like I was able to watch Maryland public television.
There used to be a standard where every road game had to be on broadcast television locally.
Yes. Right.
Because people couldn't necessarily afford to see the home games with tickets.
I think one of the times we talked, probably maybe before there was a genocide in Gaza and like before the new Trump administration came out, we probably talked about the idea of public ownership of the Orioles and, you know, like how nice it would be if Baltimore could own the Orioles. And I'm still committed to that. But, you know, we've signed a lease, we have all these things. And so at this point, it is like, look, if we are giving your billionaire owners $600 million in order to stay here, you're going to put your games on something that every working person in the state can watch.
Right. That only makes sense. And you're going to pay for that television crew to follow them on the road, not the people of Baltimore.
Right. You know, you are going to pay the same as you run your like BS cable company right now in order to broadcast their games. Yeah. We are taking that. We'll take Jim Palmer. We'll take all those assets that you have, bring them over, have them work for MPT, and have them start broadcasting Orioles games on public television, because that's the least you can do if we're giving your Michael Bloomberg and David Rubenstein own the Orioles, and all they can produce is a shitty app that barely streams the games.
I grew up in Southern California. I was a Dodgers fan. I have lots of complaints about the old O'Malley family who owned the Dodgers. There's lots of things to bitch about them for. Most importantly, them stealing the Dodgers from Brooklyn in the most underhanded and sleazy sort of way after building up the most loyal fan base in baseball. But anyway, I'm glad the Dodgers came to LA despite all that, because I'm from LA and not Brooklyn.
Yeah.
But the O'Malleys made sure, both in Brooklyn and in Los Angeles, first, that every game was on the radio where people could listen to it. And then second, that lots of games were on TV where people could see it.
Yeah, and then putting something on TV was hard because there were only a certain number of channels that had broadcast ability.
Yeah.
But now you can, I can like go watch Murder, She Wrote all day long on broadcast TV on
the Dodgers' whole broadcast for years was underwritten by a company called Farmer John's, which is the company that had the concession to provide Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles with hot dogs.
Yeah.
And so their commercials for their hot dogs are what paid for the Dodgers TV and radio programs. Yeah. And before that, when it was in Brooklyn, it was Nathan's Famous.
Yeah. And you know, like, I don't know. I mean, this is just an example to me that is like the least you can do if we're going to give an ownership group that includes Michael Bloomberg $600 million in order to not take the Baltimore Orioles to Nashville or whatever, right? Like, the least they can do is make sure that every working person in the state of Maryland can watch the games.
We need to stop giving, ideally, even beyond ideally, functionally, materially, in order to survive, we need to stop giving billionaires working people's money.
Totally. And I mean, part of the reason that I'm saying now all we can do is ask them to
put I know.
an MBT is because we already gave them the money.
Yeah, I know.
Right? Like,
well, it's like, and the corporate capture of public television.
Yeah.
Like 30% of that funding is taxpayer funding.
Yeah.
Another like 20% of that funding is the from viewers like you.
Right.
And the other half of it is the sort of corporate funding that public television is supposed to exist to give you an alternative to.
Right. Philanthropy money, foundation money, all that type of thing.
Like, right? The W.M. Keck Foundation, who financed Sesame Street for years and years and years and years. The W.M. Keck Foundation is this right-wing millionaire's trust fund for his family.
Yeah,
it exists to be the only reason it funded Sesame Street, literal communist television that was intended to provide Black people with free universal public education.
Yeah.
And it's like they're funding this for their personal benefit because it's tax deductible.
And that is also the reason that public television is unwilling to allow people outside of the Democratic and Republican parties onto their debate stage. And so one of the things that we are trying to do is to get on that debate stage and to make a focused campaign directed at Maryland Public Television in order to get them to change their editorial standards so that any candidate that is on the general election ballot gets to be in the debate on their debate stage. We think that when people hear these ideas and solutions that you and I have been talking about today and that we're talking about in our campaign, they will suddenly understand that third-party candidates are not crazy people who don't have solutions or don't understand problems, that they have different solutions that are being excluded from being heard and are being bracketed out of what is politically tangible and politically allowed. And so one of the things that I think the two-party system does is it defines what is reasonable and realistic public discourse and then tells people that anything outside of that is impossible, not real, fantasy, all of that type of thing. And I think you can begin to break that down by talking to people and showing them what those solutions actually look like and what the analysis of the problems looks like when it is distinct from Democrats and distinct from Republicans and rooted in a different set of values. And so I think that there's real important value in pushing on this debate question as it relates to public television. And I think it gets the opportunity to make the case that you're making about the private philanthropic investment in public television is really what the barrier to that type of expansion of the political possibility is. It is not the taxpayer money for the most part, right? It is in fact the philanthropic money that wants to keep the system the way that it is right now that would go away if I were able to get on stage and say that those very philanthropic organizations owe reparations for the things that they have stolen from people and the unearned wealth that they have gotten from them. They do not want that voice on the airwaves that they pay for. So they're putting the burden on the legislators and the taxpayers in order to be the ones to say no.
There's another way to externalize their costs.
Yep.
Which is the only reason that the donor class allows governments to exist is because it lets them externalize their costs.
Yep. And so, like, I think, let's see, best campaign, get on the debate stage, qualify for public financing. Qualify for public financing is a thing that no third-party candidate has ever done in the state of Maryland. But if we raise $120,000 from 1,500 donors by August of 2026, or by July of 2026, we can qualify for a 6 or 7 times match on that. And if we get a 6 or 7 times match on that, we're going to have people on the ground with paid positions.
This raises a question that I have to ask.
Yeah.
Based on the experiences of the Jill Stein campaign in 2024.
Yeah.
What happens if the federal government decides, oh, who cares if they actually made the requirements? Let's not give them the money.
The state government, but
state government. Thank you.
I think there's a good chance of that. So that's why we say qualify for public finance.
Yes. Okay.
Right. So that is certainly going to happen. So, for example, Prince George's County, one of the 4 or 5 counties that has public financing at the state level or at the local level for local elections, certainly does not have enough money to fund all the candidates that could potentially qualify for that public financing in 2024. Sure. We want to qualify for public financing first and foremost. The best alternative would be to get it. The second best alternative, but if we don't get it, it's not the end of the road. We got to think that is probably a likely outcome, and think about what it allows us to say about the public financing system as a political argument. And then we got to figure out how to alternatively fundraise off of the fact that we qualified for it and they didn't give it to us. Right.
Yeah.
But an argument to talk about the way that these Democratic controlled counties and Democratic controlled legislatures are excited to talk about public financing as a concept that may allow them to get public financing money, but are not excited about it as a means of allowing a broader, more grassroots democratic society to flourish.
We love the idea of public financing for elections if it means the Democrats or the Republicans can put more cost on the public, but we hate the idea of a democratic public financing system that actually gives time and attention to all the candidates.
Exactly. Right. So that's why I say qualify for it. I would like to qualify for it, and I hope I get it. I hope I qualify for it. I hope I get the money. If I don't, I'm going to come on your show and make a plea for folks to donate in order to make up for what the state of Maryland failed to pay out.
I do think it's important to say that it's sometimes a hard sell when you tell people up front, we're trying for 3.5%.
Yeah.
But I also understand why somebody needs to have realistic goals too. I get the temptation. Everybody wants to say I'm in it to win it, but I mean realistically the odds are against any sort of popular representation for the people right now.
Yeah. And look, like I've gone back and forth about this question a lot. Right. But like I am a student of history and a student of political science, and I can look at it and I can understand the reality that it is telling me, which is that the best a candidate has done in the state of Maryland in a gubernatorial election is 3.5%. That was a prohibition candidate running in like 1910 or something like that. So if we think about the moment we're in and the moment that was in, the idea that we would somehow do 20 times better than that and become the next governor or something.
Just think though, I mean, 1910, 3.5% to a prohibition candidate. Now that doesn't sound like a lot necessarily, but what happened in 1918?
Right. Exactly. Right. What happened? Right. Like what was the outcome of that? And in 1944, the Liberty Party got 2.5% at the national level running on an abolition platform. And the Liberty Party disappeared, but Free Soil Party and Republican Party emerged and they won on an abolition platform, and the Civil War started over it.
The New Deal started out as something Henry Wallace's father was talking about in the Calvin Coolidge administration that Republicans never bothered to invest in.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just hilarious because, I mean, I don't know if people know that. Henry Wallace Sr. was Calvin Coolidge's Secretary of Agriculture and thought up the New Deal while a Republican.
And I think, look, I've been thinking a lot about this question of like I think when the debate about third parties occurs only on social media, you fall into this DSA trope
Yeah.
trap that is like, oh, are you going to win? Are you going to win? And it is like, no, I'm not going to win. I'm not going to be the next governor. I might be. Like, if I'm the next governor of Maryland, I will rock the
I
job.
mean, you could
We will come
I
off,
mean, the thing is, and I
we will
mean,
come
I'm
off
not saying it's
inauguration.
likely, you could absolutely win under the right circumstances in the current political climate if, and this, of course, is the big reason why it probably won't happen, the work if is doing, if somehow you were able to break through to like 90% of the people in Maryland who are going to be voting but won't know who you are.
Totally. Right? Like there are scenarios in which I am the next governor of Maryland and my wife and my cats and my chickens and I move into the governor's mansion and Annapolis and like you come and help us organize town halls and you're at the inauguration and there are fantastic scenarios that are entirely within the realm of possibility, but they're not very likely, right?
Yeah.
And so what I want to talk about is like the power that third parties typically have in the United States occurs in several stages. The first is to use their ballot line in order to be able to offer alternatives and solutions that are not on offer from the two-party system.
Yes.
The second is to get into debates and use that ballot line in those positions to shape the trajectory of the election in a way that different issues are prioritized than would have been issued before. And the third is to use the threat to spoil or the actual spoiling to build power over the two parties in order to make them adopt the things that are important to the voters that are voting for you, right? Like before we get to winning, that is the role that third parties have played in the United States for a long time. They've introduced ideas into the discussion. They've used the debate to shape the outcomes of the election, and they've used the power to take away votes that other parties are relying on in order to get those parties to move and bend toward the values that the third parties have. And I think if we understand that as the power proposition and that as the theory of action, it actually becomes much easier to talk about what we're doing here instead of talking about like, well, I don't know where our chickens are going to live at the governor's mansion on Annapolis. We are going to have to build the greatest gubernatorial chicken coop that has existed since 1924. Whatever. Great. We'll have that conversation and I'm happy to entertain those thoughts. But I want to talk more about using the power of our ballot lines and the power of elections in order to transform the public debate so that outcomes bend in the direction of our values.
And that makes perfect sense, especially in a world where realistically, even if you win, then you're still dealing with a bipartisan Democratic Congress in the best case scenario.
Yeah. Right. Like, I mean, like, and I'll answer the people will say, what are you going to do if you win and the Democrats still run the majority and everything? It's like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get 5 constitutional amendments introduced in 2025 and 5 constitutional amendments introduced in 2026. And those are going to be things like establishing a public bank, creating a multi-party democracy, figuring out how to redistribute land that was taken from people, whatever those things are. We can citizen initiative. The whole thing.
The whole point of electoral politics is to give the people an avenue to make their demands from the government.
Exactly. Right. And so it's like people say, how are you going to deal with the Democrats in Annapolis? They have a veto-proof majority. They're not going to work with you on anything.
Making the same demands. Use the governor's office to make those demands. Use the governor's office to be oppositional to the portions of to be oppositional to and critical of the portions of the Democratic Party that don't serve anybody but the Democratic Party's donors.
Exactly. So it's like, so we're going to use executive power to the degree that we need to use executive power, and we're going to use our legislative power in order to put constitutional amendments in front of the voters, and we're going to tell the Democrats in the General Assembly put these 5 constitutional amendments in front of the voters, and we'll pass a decent amount of the stuff that you send our way. Don't pass these 5 constitutional amendments onto the voters, and I will veto everything you send my way, and I will use the power of referendum from the governor's office in order to put up to a vote a bunch of the other stuff that you pass, right? So it's like, I understand that there has to be compromise in that case, that we have to work with them. They have the majority of the votes and the majority in the House and the majority of the Senate. And even if I win, I might take some Greens along with me, but we're not going to break down their veto-proof majority, right? Like not in the first year. And so the idea here is, in Maryland, we don't have citizen initiatives. So the only way that we get constitutional amendments passed is if the legislature passes them and then allows voters to evaluate them. So I'm not even going to say the voters have to agree to citizen initiative. I'm going to say you have to let the voters vote on citizen initiative.
Yep.
And if you let the voters vote on citizen initiatives, I'm probably going to sign most of your bills. I'll veto one here or there, that type of thing, right? But I'm not going to start a pitched battle with you when you have the votes to win it. If you're allowing my agenda to go in front of voters. If you're not allowing my agenda to go in front of voters, then I'm going to fight you tooth and nail, and I'm going to make you spend a whole bunch of time, dealing with my vetoes. And if you do pass something over my veto, I'm going to use the governor's office to send out petitions to everybody so that they can sign referendums in order to shoot your stuff down, and so it's like, for me, it is about grassroots democracy. And fundamentally, I would probably ask for a constitutional amendment that weaken the power of the governor, because the governor has too much power in the state of Maryland right now. And it is, so I would probably ask for a constitutional amendment that weaken the power of the governor, increase the power of the legislature, and increase the proportional representation of the legislature, so that there might be some Greens, some Ujima People's Progress Party, some Forwardists, some Libertarians being able to be elected. And in some ways, it would be really easy for us to do that because we already have multi-member seats, which is kind of the hardest part about a good proportional system. We already have, in our House of Delegates, we already have 3-member districts. And it's like, great, let's keep that system, expand on it, and use it to bring proportional representation into our solidarity economy,
Well, there was one of the things that came out of the parliamentary political struggles in England that gave us liberals and conservatives in the modern sense was the idea of a court party. And the idea of a court party was that the government, in this case the king, but in our case the oligarchy, controls the officials and ministers of the government.
Yeah.
They are part of this permanent political establishment. The way that the people who became the liberals, despite being kind of conservative, decided to fight against the power of the king and his court party, were to form the country party, which whole purpose was to oppose and obstruct the royal agenda. It's the whole notion of a permanent opposition.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to understand in this point of our political development that what we are looking for is to build a permanent working class opposition before we can start talking about winning anything.
Exactly, right? I'm looking up the name. I just got this book, this August Nimitz book, The Ballot, the Streets Are Both, about Lenin's use of parliamentary electoral strategy in order to help contribute to the Bolshevik Revolution. And I think that the fascinating component is that we will need we will most likely need a parliamentary and electoral strategy for any revolutionary action to succeed. It can't be the extent of it. It can't be the end of it. It can't be the only part of it. But we have to have it. We have to have that element of what we're looking at. And we have to understand how having an opposition party can weaken the capitalist and white supremacist class in a way that can allow for radical transformation.
Well, and of course, the court party ultimately became the the country party ultimately became the country Whigs of the English Civil War, who actually attempted to replace the king with a republic. That didn't work out in the end.
Yeah.
But I mean, at some point, you have to build the grassroots if you want. Sorry, everybody. First, I saw that I needed to put power back on my computer, and then I saw that my cat was losing control again. So
mine decided that we've been on this call for a very long time.
And I should probably wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts before I wrap?
I have shared a lot of thoughts, and I really appreciate this conversation, Chris. I would love for folks to go check my website out, gogreen2026.com. We are currently getting ready to be part of the May Day March in Baltimore City. We've got some new signs that say billionaires own both parties. The Green Party is the future. And we're trying to show up there with the 40 or 50 organizations that are coming out. We really think that these Democrat, liberal, organizational sponsored marches give us a good chance to advertise a different political program. And so we are making sure that we participate in them because we think that if there is a rally that is rallying against billionaires, we need to point out that billionaires are a bipartisan institution and that it is not one party that has billionaires. So
I think this is important, if nothing else, because I look forward to the point where the Democrats are reduced to openly calling the cops on the Green Party the way that DSA has openly called the cops on the Reporters for the World Socialist website in some cases.
Yeah, and so we are excited. I am thrilled to get a chance to talk to you anytime I get the chance. Very seldom do I ever get a chance to have like 2-hour conversations on these podcasts, and I love that you create that space because we got into a lot of stuff in this time, and that doesn't happen when somebody's like, "I got 20 minutes for you."
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that. If you are in the Baltimore area, join us on May Day. We will be out at the McKeldin Plaza. We will be there holding up signs and letting people know that they have a choice rooted in peace, justice, democracy, and ecology, and that they don't have to go back to the Democratic Party in order to get out of this. And in fact, if they want to get out of the fascism and the oligarchy that we're facing right now, they must break out of the two-party system and not re-embrace the two-party system. So, we have that going on. We have this reparations policy coming out pretty soon. I started to touch on some of it. And then this summer, we're going to be unveiling our solidarity economy policy that talks about what it looks like to put the working class back in power in the state of Maryland and to put workers back in control of their workplaces and their communities. And then toward the end of the summer, we're going to be unveiling our grassroots democracy part of our platform so that we can talk about how we protect voting rights up and down the ballot and for all people and all parties, and how we give voters and workers and residents the power to take democracy back from the oligarchs and the parties that have seized it from them right now. So I'm excited to get into this stuff. And I'm also excited that June 21st, we're 500 days away from the election. And then it starts to feel really real. And all this theoretical conversation that we've had in the last 2 years leading up to this starts to become a thing about how we reach out to voters and make sure as many of them as possible understand that I am an option on their ballot and that Greens are going to be an option on their ballot up and down the ballot and across the state, and what it means to vote for us at a time like this, even if we're not going to win. It is part of rebuilding the fiber of political parties to be associational and not top-down corporate marketing structures, so that people can come together and political parties collectivize their power and change the outcomes in a way that works for everybody.
Americans are obsessed with winning, and there's this great reluctance to do anything when you know you're going to lose. But every movement is built on a lot of carefully chosen losing battles before anybody wins anything.
Yeah. And Kevin Zeese, one of my mentors, a longtime Green in Maryland who passed away in 2020, he said that, the movements are banging on the wall, and right when it feels like it is the most fragile, or right when it feels like it is the most sturdy, is when we realize it is the most fragile. Those cracks of light start to come through the wall, and we realize we're going to break through the wall, and we're going to win, and we're going to build a better world that works for everybody. I think we have that opportunity here in Maryland, foisted on us by decades of by centuries of democratic rule, and by a Republican administration who's insistent on destroying our existing economy and destroying the workforce and destroying our communities. And I think it gives us an opportunity to envision a new world that works for everybody.
I think that that's the kind of vision that we need to have right now. People certainly need that kind of option out there. Whether we end up voting in a third-party candidate or not, what matters is that we have people out there advocating without compromise for our demands, because our demands are what we have to organize around and what we have to fight for if we want to win.
Absolutely.
Andy, I want to thank you for joining me. Folks, I want to thank you for watching us. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Eclectic Radical. I'm on Blue Sky at Eclectic Radical. I'm not as active as there as I want to be, but if you pay attention there, I will be more active there. I am on Substack and Patreon at Eclectic Radical, and just follow me wherever it's easiest for you. If you feel like you can support the show, please share our content everywhere, like it, make sure people see it. And if you can afford to become a patron, please do. Right now, the show still pays for itself, but it's a constant struggle. So please be aware of the fact that we do need donors to keep going forward. And thanks for joining us again. I hope everybody has a great week. And until next week, I'll tweet at you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chris.